So hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel that is going to tackle ethical and a risk reduction approach to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. My name is Paola Cubillos. I'm a clinician, and I have played different roles in the medical cannabis industry over the past 6 years. And now I function as a scientific and medical advisor for a contract research organization that focuses specifically on psychedelics and cannabinoids therapies and clinical trials. And now we have today Natalie Villeneuve and Dr. Brian Pilecki, who will be addressing several issues related to psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy. And as we know, the interest in the promise of psychedelic therapies continue to increase across the globe, and there are many concerns and issues related to abuse and ethical misconduct that are happening within psychedelic practices, both above ground and underground. So as a result, there's a clear need to acknowledge the voices of survivors raising these concerns and to integrate a harm reduction approach and develop a stringent code of ethics and training programs for therapists. So today we have Natalie and we have Brian, who will introduce themselves, and they will talk to us about what their work has been recently in this space, and then we'll continue with the questions. So go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, hi, thank you. So I'm a clinical therapist and social worker. I work in sexual abuse prevention. So I treat individuals who have experienced trauma or who have perpetrated sexual violence. So I want to be clear, I'm actually not a psychedelic therapist. I'm not trained to provide psychedelic assisted therapy in any way. And I'm really interested in the potential that psychedelics have to heal symptoms of trauma. But my lens into this work is really around preventing harm and on facilitating healing where abuse has occurred. So I think that's important to say because I always strive for authenticity and humility as a clinician. And, I think it's important to not act competent in areas where I'm not. So yeah, really just, want to distinguish that I, work in sexual abuse prevention, and that's my lens into today's panel.
Excellent, thank you. I think honesty is really important thing for us to be able to understand what our competencies and our deficiencies are when we're approaching such sensitive topics as, and on all these areas that are really promising with respect to psychedelics-assisted therapy. And over to you, Brian.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Pilecki. I'm a clinical psychologist in Portland, Oregon. I work at a place called Portland Psychotherapy, and there I'm involved in some psychedelic research. So our big thing is we're doing a MDMA trial for social anxiety. I'm one of the study therapists and have gone through MAPS training for that. We're about to see our first participant at the time of this recording pretty soon, so excited for that. And as part of my private practice, I provide what some call psychedelic harm reduction and integration therapy. So, currently psychedelic assisted therapy is not legal except for ketamine and some exceptions. So what I can offer is providing therapeutic support to clients who are using psychedelics on their own. So I've been doing that as part of my private practice for about 3 years now. And I'll be speaking from that perspective and experience and working with those clients today.
Excellent. So you both have a wealth of experience in this area and definitely are doing a lot of work in raising these issues that we're going to be talking about today. There are many unique ethical considerations that have to be addressed with respect to psychedelics-assisted psychotherapy, from their legal status of the medicines or the substances themselves, to the fact that there is virtually minimal to no support or resources from licensing boards for the therapists as well as the professionals working in these areas, lack of diversity in psychedelic research, and this hype that we're seeing again that is being propagated in the media, and that gives a lot of hope and expectations to people. And also there's a potential for abuse and ethical misconduct. So speaking from the therapists and the clinicians that are working with psychedelics or that are facilitating the sessions, what do you both believe are some of the major risks that are associated in providing psychedelic therapy to patients and clients? Why don't we start with you, Natalie?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many issues that can arise when using such powerful medicines, and you named a few really important things that we need to consider. And I think when we're thinking about the actual context between therapy of patients and clients, one of the biggest risks is that the therapists or clinicians or guides are not properly equipped to do the work that they're doing, ultimately to heal trauma. When this is the case, this has the potential to cause serious harms, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, including causing further trauma to someone who's seeking help to treat trauma. This has happened in a number of different contexts and is going to continue to occur if we don't proactively take steps to ensure that it doesn't. So when we think about the context of the actual therapy, one of the places we can start to look is at the therapists who are facilitating these sessions. I think right now we're in a place where therapists are really excited about the prospect of psychedelic therapy and looking to get qualified to be able to provide that. And there are places out there that are offering, certifications or qualifications that are not necessarily grounded in empirical evidence, or that, are not quite what they say they are. So there are certifications that have existed that aren't actually legitimate and not really founded in anything that's providing the clinician necessarily with the skills that they need. So this is in part about the qualifications and the experience of the person who's providing that therapy. So the relevant trainings that they've had and all of that stuff. But it's also important to consider who's training these people, because there are a number of major concerns currently about the ways that trainers, teachers, and mentors have acted abusively, and then they continue to train others. So they might be imparting values that are actually quite unethical or in many cases abusive. So, beyond that, we also need to consider who are the therapists that are doing this work, right? Anyone with the means to go to school can become a therapist. Does this mean that they're going to be a good therapist? And I think about this in relation to parenting. Anyone can have a kid, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to be a good parent. What does it take to be a good parent? Well, you have to take the time to build up the relevant tools. You need to continuously assess the work that you're doing. You need to be able to be open to feedback from your child, and to accept really hard feedback from your child and consider how you might use that to better yourself. And that's just a fraction of the things you need to do to be a good parent. And a number of people aren't doing that. Some people just think, they have the kid and they've done their job, right? And that's what parenting is. So it's similar to therapy. It's not just about getting a degree or your training certificate or whatever and being done the work. Being a therapist there's a continual process of learning and self-reflecting. And some people don't have those inherent skills to do that, yet they're practicing anyway. So I think, one thing that I always consider as well when people become helpers or therapists or whatever, many people are called to the helping profession as a result of their own traumatic experiences. They've either, maybe they've had a really good experience with a therapist and they've aspired to become one themselves, or they're looking to seek some answers for themselves because of their experiences. And when we think about trauma, trauma lives in really deep areas of our brain, right? It's lives in kind of the brainstem, limbic system, areas that are really unconscious to most of us. So it takes work to actively address those things that are coming up. So when, if you've had traumatic experiences, you're going to then have a worldview shaped by this. Your sense of self might be shaped by this. And it's an active process to understand that, to address it. So for example, stuff might come up in a session that's related to your trauma response. So your inner child's need to be loved, to belong, to be seen, or to be heard. So as a therapist, it's your responsibility to understand this, to have done that work on yourself, to work on it, to notice when stuff is coming up for you and what that pertains to. And then to always address that. You have to, as a therapist, regularly kind of tap into your unconscious self. And when I say this word unconscious self, I'm so cautious when I say that in the context of psychedelics, because it's such a loaded psychedelic word. So many people, whether that's psychonauts or psychedelic practitioners, would claim that they're so in tune with their unconscious self, right? That's kind of one of the facets of psychedelic therapy. But if you claim to be in tune with your unconscious, you have to also be willing to address those harmful unconscious and conscious processes which means being willing to accept criticism and hear allegations of abuse towards you with, with grace, with openness, with curiosity, without being defensive. So you're always seeking to grow and to learn. So if someone says, I felt harmed by something you did as a therapist, you should be able to say, like, help me understand what makes you as a client feel like I made a mistake, even if I see it differently. And we don't see this a lot. We haven't seen this with a lot of people who have been accused of causing harm within these contexts. We see dismissing of those concerns. We see people shifting the blame. We see people becoming really defensive. And that ultimately is like, a shame-based response, which is very often connected to trauma. So we see it's like people who haven't done work that they need to, or in some cases, it's just a result of like a very inflated ego, which also is problematic. Like those are not the types of therapists that should be doing this work. So, if you're always working on yourself, you're seeking to understand yourself as an individual, and in your role as a helper, you're seeking, sessions with a skilled supervisor with significant experience. They're unbiased in their work, also following in all these values, I just named, then you're going to be more able within sessions to keep an eye out for things like transference and countertransference that occur with relationships with clients, which is something that is kind of amplified in psychedelic therapy. It's also important that therapists are trauma informed, which this is a word that's often overused by people as well. People will say they're trauma informed because they get it, they get trauma, but like really it's like, it's not just being like, knowing what trauma is. It's like really like your work needs to be trauma focused, where everything that you do, there's an intention to it. And it's, there's like some kind of reason why you're doing what you're doing. And it's grounded in your understanding of how the brain works in relation to trauma that has occurred. So I always say, like, good intentions are not enough. We can't go into this field just with good intentions. I want to help people, and that should be enough for me to do that. Because like it's really understandable why therapists are excited about a promising new therapy, but not everyone should be doing this work. People need to be willing to abide by a certain code of practice that's not being reflected in current practices, and it's why we're seeing a number of issues arise. So, like we talk about like risk in these therapies, like risk really means like something bad could happen. Well, something bad is actively happening right now with a number of therapists, and we need to do something to, to really address it. And ultimately, if we don't have ethical principles that are guiding this work, that are actively being kind of created by a number of people, within this space, then this stuff will continue. So we really need to address that to prevent against these risks.
Those are great insights. And it sounds like what you're saying is that it's not enough to want to help people. You need to come from a place of honesty, of understanding where you're coming from as well, understanding your own backgrounds and your own personal stories to be able to provide a safe container for people, because you're going to find people that are in these vulnerable states and really bringing up a lot of those traumatic experiences they've had, and you should be able to respond accordingly and professionally. And I guess we can get on to the code of ethics later on in the conversation. Brian, do you have anything else to add to this, to the risks, and what could be the risks for both practitioners and clients and patients as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that about all of those issues. And, I just want to say that, I think we're probably mostly talking about psychedelic assisted therapy in a healthcare setting, in a medicalized kind of environment. And just want to name that's only one way to do psychedelics. It's not the right way or the best way. There's a lot of other approaches out there, spiritual, community-based, et cetera. And part of the problem is that in healthcare, there is no predecessor to psychedelic assisted therapy. It's such a new thing that there's no other treatment that's sort of like it, that it raises a whole bunch of different issues and questions. So it's a bit like the Wild West. Licensing boards are confused, practitioners are confused. A lot of the public is confused about what's even available right now. And one thing I'd like to point out is that we are really just at the beginning of the science. We're just at the beginning of starting to scratch the surface to understand who these medicines or who this new form of treatment is best for, who is it not good for, who might it be dangerous for. And so I think part of the risk in talking to the public about this is staying true to what we know and not, when you hear about psychedelics, you often hear about it over idealized or presented in a way that is this sort of magic bullet that's just going to solve all of our problems. And I think a lot of harm can come from that. So I think it's important to talk about psychedelics in a way that sticks to what we know. A lot of when clients ask me questions about psychedelics, my response is, we don't know yet. We have some idea maybe, but we don't really know. And a part of the problem with the science so far is that it is so underrepresented by people of color, people of gender and sexual diversity. And so even though we have these very small limited trials, they're mostly of white participants. And so we don't really know how well this is going to generalize to a lot of different, a lot of different identities, populations. And part of the issue with psychedelic assisted therapy is that it's expensive because the current models, both for MDMA and psilocybin, require 2 therapists present for these long 8-hour sessions. And, the estimated cost for MAPS, MDMA treatment for PTSD is somewhere around $9,000 to $14,000. And it's unclear if insurance is going to cover that. And so, part of the issue is accessibility. Who's going to be able to afford these medicines? And I know in Canada, you're doing much better in this department than the US, but in the US, our healthcare system is very broken. And so how do we prevent psychedelic assisted therapy from just repeating all of the systemic inequities that currently exist? I think that's a task that many folks are trying to figure that out. There's a lot of people talking about that, which is hopeful. But there's these market forces, capitalistic forces that are coming in and influencing the way things are rolling out. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about what this is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the psychedelic capital that is coming into this space is definitely a complicated and a complex conversation. And definitely it's coloring the way that things are developing, and they might even contribute to these justice issues that you just raised, about access, about what kinds of individuals are going to be benefiting most from these therapies. Are we going to make it accessible to everybody, or are we going to focus on a model that focuses more on profits? And we are already sort of seeing that with the models of ketamine clinics as well, and all these chains of clinics that are popping up, like here in Canada and in the United States as well, that are offering services at relatively high prices, so therefore not accessible to the people who might most be impacted by trauma, by racial injustices, and other issues that may be affecting their well-being and their psychological development and health. But people are demanding this in a way, these services and these therapies right now. So what can we do for them in terms of harm reduction? So what is harm reduction in this context to you both? And so what are some simple strategies that therapists should be taking into account to enforce this idea that we need to reduce harm that may be coming from the use of these substances, particularly when they continue to be illegal in most settings?
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead, Natalie?
Sure, yeah. So just, for me, I think harm reduction is just that we are actively seeking ways to prevent against harm that can occur, knowing that as humans, we can and will cause harm. So it's like, we're not under the illusion that that things won't happen just because, psychedelics are different or whatever, like that. We're really looking to examples of when harm occurs, to learn from it. So we're always seeking to do as little harm as possible and learning from it when it happens. So an important part of this is listening to people who are saying that they've felt harmed. And, again, not becoming defensive by that, but instead becoming curious and wanting to find ways to work together to do better and to prevent future hurts. I think right now, like, there's a number of cases within clinical trials where people have felt harmed and they've tried to flag this, and this has largely been ignored. So this is an example of how we're not taking these opportunities to be curious, to learn from survivors' experiences. We're really trying to, or we see the field has kind of a narrative of what they want this to look like or how they want this to go forward, and are just kind of trying to find evidence that falls into that narrative rather than looking at these situations where there's like outliers to that, to understand like how, what can we learn from this? What will this teach us?
Yeah, and I would add that part of harm reduction is education, is information. So, when I started using psychedelics when I was much younger, I made a lot of mistakes and had some pretty difficult experiences, and that's part of my that's part of my motivation for doing harm reduction work. I really feel passionate about being able to talk about the use of psychedelics openly, so that the sort of the cultural practices or the wisdom of people who've gone before us and used these and can be shared, so that people can minimize the risk and maximize the benefit. So I think a lot of the good that's coming out of our current psychedelic renaissance, this period of time where psychedelics are becoming more and more popular, we see them in the media, is that people are feeling more free to talk about them, so that information can be shared and people are less likely to just kind of experiment on their own and potentially have some bad experiences or make mistakes that are kind of unnecessary and basic mistakes that in terms of like things like dosing. You want to do a little homework on what a good dose is for you if you're going to try something for the first time. And back when I was younger, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't available information, so you just kind of winged it. And so thankfully we're in a different era, and hopefully as psychedelics get more popular, more accurate information will be available to the public.
Yeah, those are all very, very important points. And I was quite taken by your paper, Brian, where you outlined quite a number of issues in terms of risks that could happen also for the therapists, whose clients might be asking questions about psychedelic therapy. Where do I go? Where do I find these substances? Can you provide this substance to me? Can we incorporate that into our therapy? So how should therapists respond to these requests from their clients and the general public?
Yeah, it's a great question. And even if you're not a therapist or a provider, it could be a doctor, it could be anything, even if you're not someone who's involved in psychedelics, as time goes on, you're likely to have clients or patients that will be asking you about them. So I think it's helpful to get some basic education. And what I talk about in the paper is that it's okay for us to provide information. It's okay for us to encourage clients to do research. The idea from a therapist perspective with harm reduction is that clients are going to do this anyway. So it's better to do it within the context of a safe and supportive therapeutic relationship with somebody who has experience, who can help guide them and make sure that they're on the right path. So sometimes clients will come to me and they say, I want to try psilocybin, and I'll help them plan out their trip. And I feel comfortable doing that because essentially what I'm doing is helping them be safe about it and making an informed choice on their own. I don't recommend, one thing or the other to client. I just help them, feel empowered to make a choice, an informed choice that feels right for them.
That's great. So we're basically talking good quality education from a neutral standpoint, where we're not necessarily over exaggerating what they might encounter at the experience, because these experiences could be negative as well. It could be quite challenging for people. So just coming from a place of honesty again, so they can learn to navigate these experiences on their own, and you feel comfortable providing that safe container and just integrating that experience into their therapy afterwards, so you can just make the best out of whatever surfaced throughout the psychedelic experience itself. It's interesting, Natalie, that you mentioned the idea of the field as a whole not being very open to criticism or to accepting, the fact that there are some reports that are coming up in terms of abuse and unethical practices, again, both from underground experiences and as well as above ground. And we all know that psychedelics have had a really complex and troubling history in Western society. And we hear about exactly the importance of not repeating the mistakes that were made throughout the 60s and 70s. But we're starting to see again sort of the similar reactive stances that some people in the field are taking in terms of not accepting that this is happening. So how do you feel like this reaction has been from the leaders in the space, or from the researchers or players that have been perhaps involved in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for quite some time? What do you think the reaction has been, and where do you think the field needs to move toward accepting more these challenging notions that bad things do and can happen?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the response has been so poor by people within this field. And this is not unique to the psychedelic space. In many cases where there's allegations of sexual abuse and ethical misconduct, the response has been to dismiss, to ignore, and to shift the blame of these accusations. And so this has been the same within the psychedelic community. But what is really unfortunate about that is that, the psychedelic space does claim to be different. They claim to be very innovative and, forward thinking, or just different than other spaces. And that's not been reflected in these practices. We see that leadership has an agenda. This is, no surprise. There's a lot of money at stake here. And as a result, leaders are often seen denying or minimizing the abuse and blaming those who've been victimized. So, lots of gaslighting towards people who have experienced abuse. And again, we see this in many spaces. This happens in contexts religious organizations where allegations of abuse arise, most recently with the Southern Baptist Church. And often, the narrative that accompanies denial and minimization is that oh, we don't want to throw away the larger mission. Don't bring that forward because that would undermine what we're trying to do here. And that's just unique to this, but it doesn't have to do with the bigger picture. But there was a case as well where a survivor was told that she would be single-handedly reinstigating the war on drugs and undoing decades of research by bringing forward her experience of abuse within psychedelic space. And this was despite the fact that the person who said that knew that she was one of hundreds of women who'd experienced sexual harm through psychedelic therapies. So the idea that we are going to just ignore that because it's too icky to address within this space, and we really don't want to undermine the movement, we want to keep going forward, is actually really counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. So, I think it's important to think about how we take responsibility, and we see things within larger organizations, people don't want to take responsibility for something that's happened because they don't feel personally responsible. So for example, a well-known case in the media was with Jensen, who was a therapist in a clinical MAPS trial, and he sexually abused a participant within those clinical trials. So then we see the organizations like MAPS really shift the blame and not take responsibility for what happened. So taking responsibility is not about saying, this was all my fault, because ultimately MAPS is not the one who caused that harm, but there's a byproduct of harm by not doing something to address it. So there should be a conversation about how can we as an organization have possibly contributed to this happen. What kind of culture are we creating that made this possible? What did we miss that allowed this to happen? What do we need to do to ensure it never happens again? And how, like, this is super important piece, is how can we heal harm caused to the survivor, right? And that can only happen if we actually listen to that person. And, you know, that's not what we're doing. So sometimes, like, the absence of doing something in the face of an event like this, like sexual abuse, is actually what is causing the harm. And what we're really seeing is how tight-knit the psychedelic community can be. So, and how closely connected many of these leaders are. And they're really protecting each other by staying silent when abuse occurs. And I think, you know, something that really keeps sexual abuse alive is when we stay silent about it. So as a priority, we need to listen to and give voice to survivors if we want this to stop, if we want to, you know, meaningfully address sexual abuse within these spaces.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it seems to me, I mean, it is well known that whenever there are all these power dynamics, you know, abuse happens. And then this is not just inherent to the psychedelic space, but also we've known that abuse happens in many other contexts, medical contexts as well, in a research context. So this is not the only time. But at the same time, I think it's important for the field to recognize that there's an element of vulnerability that is being introduced with the use of these substances. So therefore, we need to abide by a higher standard, it seems to me, in terms of, you know, proposing, you know, having an open conversation, listening to the victims, listening to the survivors of these events, and just making, you know, concerted effort of addressing these so that the field can healthily move forward. What are your thoughts on this, Brian?
You know, it's making me think about a qualitative paper that was written where, I don't know, maybe 20 underground guides were surveyed and interviewed. And they talked about what you just said, the higher degree of vulnerability with psychedelics. The fact that in 8-hour sessions, you know, there's more intimacy. You know, like, participants see us more as people. You know, when we're with them for an hour, we could sort of, you know, present a certain way. But, you know, if they see you for 8 hours, they're seeing you eat, they're seeing you yawn, they're seeing, you know, so there's all these different unique properties of psychedelic assisted therapy that potentially make the potential for boundary violations, for abuse, even higher. And in this article, you know, the underground guides are asked, how do you mitigate against this? How do you, you know, how do you be aware of this, and how do you respond to it? And, you know, some of their answers is similar to what Natalie said earlier, which is, you know, we have to really do a lot of work on ourselves. We have to be very aware of, you know, our, you know, it can be intoxicating when someone goes and into this psychedelic trip and you're the therapist and they have this amazing experience and amazing change. It's easy to feel like, oh, I'm doing something really wonderful here. And so there, I think, talking about it, naming it, acknowledging it is so important. And I agree with Natalie that I kind of came into psychedelics, you know, thinking that, oh, this is a different space, maybe over idealistic, and then realized that, you know, people are people everywhere. You know, I'm involved in some Buddhist communities, and even there's sexual abuse that happens. You know, in traditional therapy, there continues to be you know, rates of boundary violations and abuse that happens. So I think we can't pretend that this space is somehow different or to have transcended these issues.
I agree. And I think what's really important as well is that we're, like, by addressing it, that would be what we're doing different to other spaces that have not been, you know, willing to do that. And my worry about the field is that this will, like, the lack of addressing it is actually going to be what undermines it, because there is a lot of people within the general public who are not yet on board with the idea of psychedelics being out there, accessible to people. And then when we think about people who are already on the fence, who then hear that, oh, there's sexual abuse happening, like, that's a really great way to just you know, shut down the field altogether. And this has happened before, right? And we don't want that to happen. And leaders in this field don't want that to happen. So it is really counterproductive that they're kind of putting these blinders on to what's going on and saying like, let's just like ignore the things happening and try to get this forward, because it's like there's almost like a rush to get this like legalized really quickly so that we just get it done and then it's accessible. But we really need to slow down and not like put the cart before the horse, and we need to slow down and understand like what are we doing and how do we do this the best way possible so that it actually becomes safe and accessible for everyone in the future.
Mm-hmm. As somebody who spent quite a bit of time in research ethics and just thinking about these issues, that there might be a great, societal need to provide solutions quite quickly, but people might not understand that things take time and we need to be slow and rigorous and really judicious on the way that we think about these problems, and setting up, a strong foundation before we can move forward, because otherwise people are going to get hurt in the process. We also need to recognize that power is very intoxicating, and it's not just here again in the context of psychedelics. It can be intoxicating in any other political contexts even, but we need to check in with ourselves quite frequently, and institutions need to provide that space as well for people to be able to do that and to openly tackle and disclose whenever these things are happening, so that they feel comfortable talking about them, and then they feel heard, which is really important. And sometimes institutions are not very good at establishing these procedures or these spaces so people can feel comfortable disclosing and talking about these things, which leads me to the next question. It seems like a lot of the responsibility is relying on individuals' practices and their all moral compass. So it doesn't look like there are a set of standards that can guide therapists and that can guide people through ethical conduct in this space. So I know, Natalie, that you're working on some initiatives with respect to establishing a concrete code of ethics. So what, in your opinion, would be effective oversight and ethical guidance for psychedelic practitioners? And what would be the major hurdles to prevent, abuse from happening in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major hurdle right now is that like we haven't established a culture of consent and ethical conduct within the psychedelic field. Right now, we're kind of in a culture of operating at the margins of the law or just outside of it. And so that needs to shift. Our entire field needs to establish a culture of ethical conduct and to really embrace this. And so that means that we establish a code of ethics that are implemented fairly, consistently, and firmly. And it's not enough to just say like, oh, here's our code of ethics. We've addressed the problem of abuse. And we've seen like, that was really MAP's response when abuse happened. Like, oh, we'll tweak our code of ethics, but it's there. And ultimately our therapist didn't follow it, and that's on them. And then that was the extent of the response, rather than, okay, what's going on again within the culture of how we do this work, that something failed there. And so when we think about what, oversight or ethical guidance really looks like, it needs to be established by a range of individuals, right? It can't just be one organization with a monopoly on this, because there's a lot of bias in that. There's individuals and leaders pushing their own agenda. And again, that's kind of what we're seeing right now. That's what we see generally in lots of systemic structures within society outside of the psychedelic space. And we're seeing that repeated here, that it's like, big organizations have, ownership of a lot of this and are moving forward with their agendas. And this can't be established by just those people. They can be included, but it needs to be a range of people who have come up with something. So, you mentioned that I've been working on these initiatives, and first off, again, I want to be humble here and say that I don't have all the answers, right? I'm one single person who has some specialized knowledge in certain areas that I can contribute to the conversation. And so there's hundreds of others who also have that, and we need to put our minds together to be able to come up with something that is meaningful and that will address the current gaps, and that will look to all of these unique experiences that don't fit kind of the norm, to understand like, what do we do to catch those things when they happen. So one of the things that I've been working on with a group of others has been to create like a vision for ethical oversight, which really should be kind of like not any like top-down thing, but really just a bunch of us coming together and deciding like, what is ethical practice within this field. So for anyone listening to this, that can be found on a website, psychedelicethics.net. So the vision is available there. And ultimately the goal of this is that, it's been created right now, but we're looking for feedback from a number of people who can offer their input into how we can tweak things, how we can do things differently, what we've failed to consider within that. And we need a number of people to kind of establish this. Again, like, I'm one person and I'm not under the illusion that I can make this happen and I can, save the field by establishing ethics, right? It's like a number of us need to get on board with this new culture, this culture of ethical conduct, this culture of informed consent, all of that stuff. We need to change the culture within the field. And I also kind of, I say field, and I kind of distinguish between like the words movement and field, because there's a movement happening right now, which is kind of like a bunch of people just really wanting this to happen and being really on board with like this, like pushing that agenda or what they're hoping to see happen. And then there's like the field, which should be more critical and like curious and looking at the science and looking for when things don't add up the way that they expected, right? When the hypothesis doesn't test out the way that they kind of hoped. Like that's what science is. We're looking for those experiences to understand where those differences lie. So really we need to move from this movement mindset to a field mindset, and then within that field establish a culture of ethical conduct. So anyone listening who thinks they can be a part of that, please join in, because again, we need a lot of people to be at the foundation of this.
Absolutely. So the more perspectives you bring to the table as well, what they're wholesome, more comprehensive these initiatives are going to be, and they're going to have more buy-in into people understanding that the culture needs to change to be able to provide a safe environment for these substances to function and to actually benefit people the way we expect them to. What about you, Brian? You're in Oregon, and there's huge legislative movement happening over there. And I'm sure that all these codes of ethics and conversations of oversights are happening are there as well. So what can you offer in terms of your experience over there?
Yeah, so in Oregon, we are finishing a 2-year process of creating a psilocybin service program for the public, which will be available next year. And I think that where this fits in is the training programs have a certain amount of hours they have to spend on each of these several topics, including ethics. And so it's really important that training programs do this well and integrate this into the training in a way that's that's really integrative and not just an add-on, not just something at the end, not just like be ethical, but like that it's interwoven throughout all of the practices of preparation, dosing, integration, doing your own work as a therapist. So I think there's a lot of burden on training programs to, as they develop their curriculums and they actually start to see students, whether that's here in Oregon or in other states, that this is an integral part of that experience as for new therapists.
Yeah, absolutely. So the education and the thorough understanding of these issues that can be brought about with the use of psychedelics in a therapy context need to be taught and just addressed from the ground up, so people can actually embed those values eventually when they go and face the client and understand where the limits lie and why things are being taught or being done in the way they're being done. So that is super critical there, and hopefully we're going to see a lot more of that sort of ground up work happening everywhere else where psychedelics are going to be implemented as part of a therapeutic approach. And so I've heard this conversation as well online in academic forums, that we have all these ethical issues surfacing because we have lost touch with the way that these substances have been used traditionally in indigenous settings. So very much the fact that now these substances are being applied in a purely biomedical model, which has led to the criticism that this psychedelic assisted therapy is just another example of colonialism or cultural appropriation. So we're definitely taking many elements of the ways that traditional communities have been using these substances and just making them our own, and just making them in a corporate setting, and establishing all these beautiful spaces to be more approachable for people in the West. And we're also seeing a general lack of diversity in the field. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how we can help bridge this gap and ensure that we acknowledge that Western forms of therapy don't have a monopoly over the psychedelic experience, and we honor these traditions that have been with these communities for centuries, and that have done so much to further and to bring well-being to their community. So how can we bridge this gap between the Western and the other traditional ways of using psychedelics?
Mhm. I think, one of the things that I think of is, I think people get scared when they hear the words like colonialism and cultural appropriation, and then they feel like, oh, well, we can't do anything then, because, does this mean we can't engage in these practices if there's like if they're traditionally indigenous practices? So I think, I want to emphasize, it's not about like, we can't do this because it belongs to them, but rather, how can we learn from the people who know this best, and how do we not, take from them what is rightfully theirs, like we've done traditionally over, hundreds of years. So, first of all, like, Indigenous and other marginalized voices really need to lead the conversation. So it's not enough to just include them and say like, oh, well, we've got an Indigenous person on the board, so, that's enough. It's like, no, these people need to actually lead the conversations. When we think about like what colonialism is, it's about like taking away from someone. So the opposite is to give that back. So colonialism occurred because white settlers believed that they knew what was best, and therefore what the others knew was inherently wrong or savage or evil. And so they sought to abolish those ways of knowing altogether. So the opposite of this is to recognize, just as Indigenous people did prior to colonization, that every culture or every people have different ways of knowing, different teachings that are valuable and worthwhile. So this is what decolonizing means, really. Like, how do we look directly at the ways that colonialism is impacting how we do things? How do we deconstruct this? And then how do we do things from a different worldview, not from a colonialist worldview? So I think this starts with having a genuine belief that the Indigenous worldview is valuable, right? So this is not performative of saying like, again, like we've got that Indigenous person on our team, so we've met our quota there. No, it's like, actually believing that Indigenous worldviews are valuable. And I say Indigenous here to encompass Indigenous cultures all over the world, all of which are extremely different and bring their own value and knowledge to the table. And there's a word that kind of describes this. So two-eyed seeing, this is an approach that really is about embracing the positive contributions of both Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. So when we think about decolonizing, like, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to go back to a totally decolonized way, that we're going to abolish everything that colonialism has brought, because we're living in a very colonialist world. That's pretty hard to do. What can we embrace from the Western ways of knowing, from Western science? What can we embrace from Indigenous ways of knowing? And then so we think about just like Indigenous values versus colonialist values. So Indigenous values are about like learning rather than taking, collaborating rather than owning, right? Colonial values are all about like power and ownership and status and like individualism, while Indigenous values are about collectiveness and community and learning from each other's strengths, using each other's gifts, reciprocity, balance, like not taking more than you need. So I really think like, how can we apply these values to the current space? And when we think about the biomedical model, like we're not doing that right now. This is like a product of capitalism and big pharma. We're giving all the power to the wrong people, and this is making access for marginalized groups more limited. So, we already mentioned that the research right now has sample sizes of only white participants, and often by only white researchers. So like, what's going on here? Clearly, we're not making it safe for more people to participate in these spaces. And there's a lot of discourse within the spaces of like, oh, like we need more diversity and whatever, but what are we actively doing to make that happen? The fact that most legal access to these substances is in a very clinical setting, by a person who has diagnosed you to be in need of this, and who charges you a fortune and makes it pretty hard to actually access it. Like, this is a very colonialist thing. So I think we need to start there and look at the ways that we're practicing from a very colonialist perspective and seek to incorporate Indigenous values and Indigenous voices to deconstruct that.
Those are really important points, and I want to highlight something that what you said about the Indigenous values being more about community and collectivism. And while we're thinking about the way that these substances are going to be applied in a therapeutic setting, we usually think about two people monitoring the treatment and just going through the therapeutic process with the person, as opposed to a collective effort and a collective a space where people can share and experience similar experiences, if you will. And I don't know, Brian, if that is something that is being talked about already in Oregon, of already opening these communal spaces where people can potentially experience in a setting where there's a leader, perhaps leading the ceremony, if you want to call it that way, or leading the experience, and just incorporating more of these a collective, we're in this together kind of situation that we usually see with the Indigenous ways of using psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah, the Oregon model was meant to be something outside of a medical model. And so some critics will say that it didn't go far enough. It's still too medicalized. There is an alternative framework that's being proposed, which is more of a community-based model, which is sort of like what you're describing, but that's not going to be part of the initial rollout. I think we sort of know that we're not going to get it right away. It's a new thing, and that hopefully over time it will improve. Definitely has its critics, but yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on this. I'll just add one quick thing that when we talk about the harms and colonialism, it's not just of the past. There are active harms now in Indigenous communities that are a result of the psychedelic renaissance. So just one I'll name is that a lot of Indigenous peoples don't have access to their medicine. It's running out. They don't have access to peyote or iboga or ayahuasca. And so there's things that we can do to actively prevent people from going into communities and taking, and so this is not just something of the past, it's something that's actively occurring currently.
Mm-hmm. And I might also add, just to your point about community, like when we think about the ways that we're currently operating, it makes sense that there's power dynamics that occur and then abuse that occur as a result of that, because we're not operating from that collectivist mindset. And that's one way that we need to kind of change our approach and even address when abuse happens. There's some practices within different Indigenous cultures that really meaningfully address harm after it occurs, including both the person who caused the harm and who experienced the harm. And I think that's so important for these spaces, and we have a lot to learn from those ways of knowing.
Absolutely. So definitely just listening to the people who've been doing this for centuries. Yeah. And not overlooking that experience. I'm sure there's a lot that can be learned. It is difficult sometimes, and even in my own biomedically very much oriented mindset, it seems difficult to put those two together, but I'm sure we need to find a way, because again, these communities have had the experience for centuries that we haven't had, and there's a lot to be said about including the sense that we're doing all of this collectively for a reason, and this might protect us against, these power dynamics and these abuses that you just mentioned, which is something that, unfortunately and regrettably, we're seeing in this space. So thank you both. This has been a really, really important conversation. I want to thank you, not just for participating in this panel, but also for the work that you're doing, just raising on these issues and talking about them, and just harnessing the power that you each have to educate and to bring people together to talk about these things as well. I strongly believe that the more we talk and we discuss these things openly and, without necessarily an agenda, but the only agenda just being contributing to the responsible, rational use of these substances in a therapeutic setting, I think it's really key. And we're going to continue breaking ground. And the voices are going to get louder with respect to the ethical issues that are popping up and the answers that we can provide to those issues. So thank you again. And I thank the conference for inviting me to moderate this panel and to listen to these wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.